What is the gospel? This isn't just good news for us, it's good news for the world.
And so when we care for the world, we care for issues that impact the world.
When we study the Gospels, we learn about Jesus' favorite themes. And clearly his favorite theme was God.
The only way you really discover the good stuff of the kingdom is when we let God break apart our mediocre assumptions.
For too long, we've preached a cross that is too small.
We want the Word of God to be proclaimed in a way that people can listen and be changed for His glory and the building of His kingdom.
I have often said so many times that the bride of Christ has an anemic imagination when it comes to the role of women within the church. When women teach, when women preach, when women lead, when women minister, when women evangelize, the world stops in their tracks and takes notice. There's something radiant and beautiful about these people, that there's something stunning about the bride. So what we need is men and women joining together arm in arm with dirt in their fingernails on the road to proclamation that Jesus is alive. Now is the time to teach about the full inclusion of women and men in leadership. Now is the time to reclaim the kingdom vision for gifted women in the church. I'm Tara Beth Leach, and I want to invite you into an exploration of emboldening women in ministry.
We're in a time where our country is more diverse than ever and more divided than ever.
What is the gospel? This isn't just good news for us, it's good news for the world.
And so when we care for the world, we care for issues that impact the world.
When we study the Gospels, we learn about Jesus' favorite themes. And clearly his favorite theme was God.
The only way you really discover the good stuff of the kingdom is when we let God break apart our mediocre assumptions.
For too long, we've preached a cross that is too small.
We want the Word of God to be proclaimed in a way that people can listen and be changed for His glory and the building of His kingdom.
Hello, hello. Welcome everybody to this special seminar where I am Nijay Gupta and I'm here with my friends and colleagues, Dr. Beth Felker Jones and Pastor Tara Beth Leach. We're coming here under the sponsorship of Seminary Now, a streaming platform delivering video courses in Bible, theology, and ministry from a diverse group of leading professors and authors. Just to help you learn a little bit more about it, here's a short video sample from Seminary Now.
We're in a time where our country is more diverse than ever and more divided than ever.
What is the gospel? This isn't just good news for us, it's good news for the world.
And so when we care for the world, we care for issues that impact the world.
When we study the Gospels, we learn about Jesus' favorite themes. And clearly his favorite theme was God.
The only way you really discover the good stuff of the kingdom is when we let God break apart our mediocre assumptions.
For too long, we've preached a cross that is too small.
We want the word of God to be proclaimed in a way that people can listen and be changed for his glory and the building of his kingdom.
I love those trailers. That music just makes you like ready to buy some popcorn and watch a good movie. If you're watching this on seminarynow.com, we encourage you to preview the many, many dozens of courses we have. Great videos, great scholars, great teachers. We also are doing a giveaway. We're giving away a 1-year subscription to Seminary Now. If you want to try to win that, share this live stream on Facebook, and then we'll draw a winner. You can share up to 24 hours after the event. Okay, now talking to my colleagues here, I want to introduce them. First up, Dr. Beth Felker Jones is professor of theology at Northern Seminary. She earned her doctorate at Duke University and blogs on Substack at Church Blogmatics. By the way, probably the best name for a theology blog I've ever heard. Kudos to that. She's author of several books, such as Practicing Christian Doctrine, Introduction to Thinking and Living Theologically, and The Marks of His Wounds, Resurrection Doctrine, and Gender Politics. Welcome, Dr. Beth. Thanks for joining us. How are you today?
Great. Thanks. Good to see you all.
And you have I think you have a new edition of Practicing Christian Doctrine out or coming out this summer?
It'll be out this summer. Yeah. So ready for
All
fall
right.
classes if folks need it.
All right. So be on the lookout for that. Google that. Look that up at your favorite bookstore. And also with me, Pastor Tara Beth Leach, pastor at Good Shepherd Church in Naperville, Illinois. She's a graduate of Olivet Nazarene University and Northern Seminary. Notice the theme here. Author of Kingdom Culture, Emboldened, and Radiant Church. She's also a regular writer for Missio Alliance, has contributed to other publications like Christianity Today, Christian Week, and Jesus Creed. Hello, Pastor Tara Beth. How are you? I can't hear you, so I'm wondering if you're muted at the moment. There we go.
Hi, my name is Tara Beth Leach, and I've never done a webinar before, clearly.
Welcome.
Yes. Hey, Nijay. Thanks for organizing this. I'm so happy to be here today.
Now, you are in a new gig. Can you tell us a little bit about how long you've been in this gig and what you do at Good Shepherd Church?
Yeah, I am the brand new senior pastor at Good Shepherd Church in Naperville. And this is a church that I was on staff with many years ago as a youth minister. And hey, this is the church that sent me and sponsored my seminary. And so if it weren't for this church, I wouldn't be a graduate of Northern Seminary. And this place is a place that gave me some of my first opportunities to teach, preach, and lead. And so I am week 7 in, and we are having a blast.
Great. Yeah, it is exciting. I think going back to a place you already know, new but different. And you have great colleagues. Some of your colleagues are some of my current students. So I'm excited for you. Just a note before we dive into the topic at hand, for those that are viewing and listening, we want your questions. So post them in the chat box anytime during the event. We're going to look at them after we kind of get initial conversations going. And we'd love to hear from you about what you want to talk about as well. So the topic today is why women matter. And it's about women and men in ministry in the church. I've thought about how I want to start. I want to start with a little anecdote that's probably a little bittersweet. I used to watch the Colbert Report on Comedy Central back in the day when Stephen Colbert was on Comedy Central. And I remember him having Cornel West on the show when Cornel had just published a book, I think, called Hope on a Tightrope. And it was funny. Stephen Colbert said to Cornel West when he came on, first thing he said was, "Now that racism is no longer a problem in this country, what do you do with your time?" And I thought about that because in the year of our Lord 2023, we're still talking about the experiences of women in the church. And so I actually want to start with Tara Beth and just ask you, you have written on women in ministry in the church. It's a passion of yours. You obviously have the experience of it. You have quite a number of years under your belt of experience in the church. What would you want to say to a younger Tara Beth Leach if you could go back to that first year of ministry? And you don't want to blow their mind, but I'm sure looking back, the road was more windy and you maybe hit some potholes and bumps. What would you say going back? I don't know how long, but going back, what would you want to say?
Yeah, Nijay, it's hard to believe, but this is going back over 20 years ago that I've been in pastoral ministry now. I graduated from Olivet Nazarene University with a degree in youth ministry in 2004 and have been going ever since, and was serving in ministry while I was in school. And so I think if I were to go back to that younger Tara Beth, I would look at her through her very naive eyes, and tell her that there will be some difficult days, but you will survive it. Not only will you survive it, but you'll come out thriving, and God will form you in those wilderness moments. God will shape you in those wilderness moments, and to just keep taking one faithful step after the next. I think that's what I'd say.
It's what kind of surprised you? You don't have to get specific. You don't have to name names, but you have ministered in contexts that overtly support women. Theologically, the paperwork's there, the statement, they did the theological work in the 20th century. My wife is a pastor. She has lots of pastoral experience similar to you in her background. And she has been surprised that she's been in contexts that doctrinally support women, but her experience has been different. Can you just give us a picture or a taste of what kinds of things surprised you in your experiences of just the challenges that women face in ministry?
Yeah. So when I first started off in ministry, it was disorienting because I would be so caught off guard because I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't expecting the questions to come my way that were questions that appeared to have a very confused framework for how women and men are to relate with one another. And on some of this framework comes from a misreading of Ephesians chapter 5 and even Colossians household codes. I can remember early on sitting with a committee where I was being interviewed about licensing for my denomination. And some of the questions they were asking were, well, if God calls you to a particular church and your husband doesn't, will you submit to him? And again, like I contend that a lot of our issues, not only is it a hermeneutical issue, hermeneutical crisis, but I think that it's these household codes that people get really tripped up on. And so for me as a pastor, that's been one of the greatest, my greatest challenges is helping people have a better understanding of mutual submission. Because then if we can get the household right, I think then we can also get how women and men in the church can also interact. And so then if you were to just fast forward a little bit through the years, these things really begin to pile on. More questions would come my way when I had children. A lot of confusion from people as to why I wouldn't walk away from ministry entirely for 10, 15 years, 18 years until the children are out of the house. When I was called to be a lead pastor, one of the greatest concerns for people was that I was a mom with two little boys at home. Caleb and Noah were 4 and 6 years old. And so there were a lot of questions like, how can she pastor if she has children? That, like, as though that disqualified me. And that was very common. There was a gentleman once that I had made an analogy in a sermon, an illustration in a sermon, that I don't cook well, that I can hardly boil water. And it was very just tongue in cheek. And he later posted online that how can we have a pastor when she doesn't even know how to cook? And so, but, I think where it came to a head for me, Nijay, was in 2016 when I stepped in to be the lead pastor at a church in Pasadena, where within the first month, from the time that they announced my name to the vote to my second week, 600 people exited the congregation because they simply could not do a female pastor.
And you're still in ministry, so there's a good story somewhere in there.
There's a good story. God is rewriting things. Like, it's good. It's yes. There's a good story.
I will come back to you. I want to switch over and ask Beth. You've written on the subject. I went back to 2007. You've written on the subject of the body and gender politics. Does this come into play when we talk about women's lived experiences in the church and leadership and otherwise? I haven't read your book, but I saw that title and I thought, gosh, she's the right person for this conversation.
Yeah, as a theologian, I think the body always comes into play because God created humans as embodied creatures, and whether we pay good attention to that or not, we can't ignore the realities of our embodiment. And questions about gender and the relationship between men and women and callings for women are always then questions about women's bodies. As Tara Beth just said, when you had children, right, questions came up. That's certainly a question about the body, right, about reproductive biology and how it works and what it means. And in fact, I got interested in theology of the body because I was pregnant with my first child the first year of my PhD work. And that made me very aware of myself as a gendered embodied person in every room, right? Often in rooms with very few women in them. So, at a base level, I think it helps to notice that bodies are part of this conversation, that they exist, that they matter, that they're good. God created our bodies good, created male and female good in the image of God. And so women's bodies may scare people sometimes. I think that's fair. But they don't scare God. They don't scare Jesus, who interacted with women in embodied relationships without fear. And I hope we can live in that goodness, right? All of us, the goodness of our embodiment.
Beth, we're talking about women ministry, but I think the Academy experiences a lot of the same challenges, poses a lot of the same challenges for women. I don't want to put stories into your life, but I wonder, while you were listening to Tara Beth talk about her experiences in the church and what men say to her, or assumptions or perceived limitations, has that been a part of your story too? And how has that affected you, and how have you responded to that?
Sure, it absolutely has. And in my own particular location in the Academy, right, as a teacher of theology, which I understand as a calling to ministry, it's an especially close relationship, right? So I'm not an ordained pastor, but I see my work and God's call in my life as ministerial in lots of ways. So I think the short answer is just yes. all women experience the ways we live in a world that is misogynist, that doesn't love women. And sometimes that's experienced in ways that are very hard to describe or to document if one wanted to document them. For instance, there are studies that show that if a male professor and a female professor give the exact same lecture with the exact same slides, using the exact same motions, students will rate the male professor much higher, right? Now, normally we're not all giving the same lectures, and so it's very hard to document that there's this kind of inbuilt worry about being under the teaching of a woman. I've certainly known students who purposely avoid my courses, and I might prefer that to other possibilities. And sometimes it's very visible. Very early in my teaching career, I was lecturing on the doctrine of the Trinity and on the Trinitarian heresies. And a tall young man in the middle of the room raised his hand, and I called on him, and he stood up and said, "Yes, I'm just wondering, where are your kids right now?" And I'm not always quick on my feet, and I didn't, I think, fully process the sort of meanness of his intent until much later. At a very important meeting in my career, someone with power over me asked, "How are your husband and children dealing with you working?" Right? That's an illegal question, but it's not a question that doesn't get asked, and it's certainly not a question that doesn't get felt. Tara Beth, your story about whether you would submit to your husband in terms of your call, right, is a really sad understanding of marriage. And I think in the same case with this question, my household is an economy where we all try to help each other flourish, particularly my husband and I. And I can't imagine a situation in which he wouldn't try to support me in what we're discerning as God's call in my life. Sadly, I know that's not the case, though, in every marriage. No.
Thanks for sharing that. I want to talk a little more kind of big picture about what's going on in the United States and what's going on broadly culturally in churches. I want to start off with, I get the question a lot from people that have read my book, Tell Her Story. They ask me, are things getting better for women? I think the assumption is, the further we get in time past the civil rights era, the better things should be for women, right? And I actually say they seem like they're going in the wrong direction in many ways. So I'm going to give a little bit of cultural analysis. I'm not an expert in this, but I'd be curious what both of you think about this. I've done a little bit of study just because of the biblical studies issues on the way that scholars have talked about men and women prior to the civil rights era and after. So prior to civil rights era, it was very common for commentaries and other biblical studies books to talk about the reason why women shouldn't be pastors is because they're less intelligent or they're gullible or they're too emotional or they're focused on relationships versus objective decision making. This was really, really common prior to the 1960s, even in the 70s, even into the 80s, to be honest. As you have more and more women senators, high achieving academics, politics, business world, it becomes less valid and intellectually honest to be able to make those arguments that kind of give these blanket stereotypes. So I saw the narrative shift to gender roles. The language of gender roles was less about pure capability and more about setting, like the sphere. Someone has to take care of the family. God ordained it should be women. It wasn't saying that there aren't sensitive men. It wasn't saying there aren't, brilliant women, but to say there are these places. I think that's where, the go home statement for Beth Moore, I think that fits into this general narrative. But I think with 2016, that's why I winced when Tara Beth said it. She said it for a different reason, but I'm thinking of the Trump era. I'm thinking of the pandemic. I'm thinking of the rise of social media as kind of the dominant way of interacting. I feel like there was some ground lost with the gender roles era because that kind of created a vacuum in which women pastors could thrive because the arguments weren't used against them, really. And women found ways to get into ministry through the back door, digging a hole through the roof, getting in through the bottom. My wife backdoored into ministry constantly. So I think that created this vacuum. And now there was this kind of scramble. Oh no, women are taking over. They weren't really, but there's this perception. So I think with the political divide that's happening and the camps and the polarization that's been fueled by the isolation of the pandemic and social media, I feel like the gender wars are back with a greater fury. This is the 1950s in 2023. I might be completely making that up or exaggerating, but either of you can chime into reactions to that. Just the experiences of my wife, the experiences of my students, the experiences of people that I see on social media. I feel like we have dialed the clock back a bit in some ways. Am I making that up? Give me your honest opinion on that. Either of you.
I think you're naming some of the ways and some of the reasons that a lot of the church conversation about women in ministry just doesn't make sense, and is sometimes incoherent. I have a little argument with myself sometimes. Would I rather that someone say, Tara Beth shouldn't be a pastor because she's inferior? Or would I rather they say, Tara Beth shouldn't be a pastor because even though she's perfectly qualified, God says so?
Right.
Both are pretty awful, but I tend to lean towards the second being worse, right? Because it really suggests that God is not good, right? Or just, or reasonable. And I always revolt when someone suggests that something that is not good is nonetheless the mysterious will of God. There's all kinds of things culturally, and I'm curious what Tara Beth has to say. But I think for the generation of women who are where we are, mid-career, now, we've tried very much in some ways to have it all without systems to support that.
Good point.
You can do a lot if you have a husband who supports, but bigger systems are needed. And I think a lot of younger women are seeing that it's really hard without systems to support that. And so are reconsidering whether they can move into, say, a ministry role while also hoping to be a mother or what have you. So we need systemic change, and we need coherent theology, and we need to remember that God is good. I also think, and I'll stop with this, that when God is at work to set people free, the powers and principalities try to bite back. And that's a lot of what we're seeing as well. So.
Yeah. And, Nijay, I think the illustration that you just gave us with your assessment throughout history will feel validating to a lot of women, because women in ministry often feel crazy for the things that we're experiencing. We feel like we're imagining the things. We feel like we're overreacting. We feel like we're creating a problem because these things are happening and it's hurtful and we're afraid to speak up. And so you're naming a reality that women are experiencing. Going back to 2016, it was, compounded with everything that was happening during the Trump election and the incredible misogyny that we saw. And the, leading up to the election, I was at that time was pastoring a more of a conservative evangelical church. And so there was just like this visceral reaction to Hillary Clinton and her leadership. Mm-hmm. And some of what I was feeling was it was hard for some of these conservative evangelicals to not conflate my place as a female leader and someone like Hillary Clinton, who they were despising. As a female pastor, as a woman pastor, within some of these more conservative evangelical churches, it is automatically that because I'm a woman, I'm going to be very progressive. And so they start to kind of go down a path. Well, she believes in women in ministry, so she must be working off of a feminist agenda. So she
Slippery
must
slope.
Yeah, yes. Wayne Grudem started that lovely one for us. It's a slippery slope, and so so she must be pro-abortion, and this is why I'm always really, really, something I say in these environments is women in ministry is old school. It's not a progressive idea, and that it's biblical. In other words, this isn't something that we've progressed
Amen,
towards.
amen.
We've regressed. And so what you're naming is, I do think 2016 and just this, where we saw this president who was, I'm going to use a word that I love so much, emboldened, but in the worst way, like, to be a misogynist in the public square in the name of Christianity, and Christian leaders were endorsing this and perpetuating. It gave permission for then this to trickle on in churches. And it also gave permission to show this like hatred towards women leaders. And so I do think we are going backwards. And I do look at 2016 as a very difficult landmark moment for women in leadership and women in ministry.
I want to talk a little about leadership. We've put our finger on some problems, and it's interesting, because I just had this book come out, I'm getting a lot of comments about it. And so I read this one review, which was kind of heartbreaking and encouraging at the same time. A woman had made a Goodreads review, and she wrote, I was discouraged in college. She went to Bob Jones. She said, I never heard anything like this supporting women in college. And then she said, had I read this book, my book, when I was in college, I would have become a pastor. I would have went to seminary and become a pastor. So I want to talk a little about leadership. I know for women, especially through my wife, you have to make a decision sometimes to just be silent and accept the misogyny, because you can't say everything all of the time to everybody. And sometimes you have to speak up and speak out and push and quit or challenge, or, I'm watching this TV show called The Diplomat, which is about a female ambassador. And she's experiencing, I'm thinking about this because she has to just,
it's so good. It's such a great show.
It's a great show. She has to, she has to accept these horrible misogynistic comments sometimes, all with the view to being able to get to a place where she can do more good, right? I'm sure both of you face that challenge. We'll start with Tara Beth. How do you decide when to just bite your lip, bite your tongue? And because I'm sure it happens all the time. And when do you say enough is enough? Have you discerned? I'm sure you've created some sensibilities for this over the years. How do you encourage other women in ministry and in leadership on when to speak and when not to speak? And maybe I'm getting this wrong, but just help me out here.
No, it's really good. So there's a couple of things that I want to reflect on. The first thing is, I'm a mom. I am a mom. My body has birthed 2 children, and I preached sermons until I was 40 weeks pregnant. I preached sermons with babies on my sling while nursing, and because of like that experience that I've gone through, I can't help at times but to view pastoring through the lens of mothering, because mothering has been a profoundly formative experience that has happened within my body that has shaped who I am. And so, and I want to say, like, for also though, like, I don't think that every woman needs to view pastoring through the lens of mothering. I do. And so when I think about a mother, there's a nurturing sometimes that happens. You have this image of the eagle with, the young ones like in the nest. And, eventually there's a firmness where she starts push, she's like, it's time. And so for me as a pastor, it is a dance and a balance between the nurturing role of as Scott talks about, nurturing goodness within cultures, nurturing, but also when there needs to be something firm. And a really, really important thing for me that I have to discern is as I'm growing in my emotional awareness, and I hope emotional intelligence, is, am I responding while also bleeding out everywhere? I would say early on, Nijay, I was not fully aware of how it was doing damage in my own emotions. And I wasn't doing the work to name them, to work through them, to heal. And so I was incredibly enmeshed with all of the things that were said to me, with all of the things that were projected upon me. And what I started to do is I started to punish people in the pulpit through my sermons, through my writing, through my tweeting. And one of the things that I'm learning is, yes, like correction needs to come. But I want to do it from a place of being grounded. I want to do it from a place of healing and not bleeding out. And so that takes time for me to be able to name some of those things. And so it's just like it's a constant tension.
Sounds like there has to be some, self-awareness there. Did you have supports like I have a spiritual director or some people have therapists? What kind of support systems have you been relying on?
Yeah. So I have a therapist, I have a psychiatrist, I have a spiritual director. I
All the
have,
stuff.
yes, I have coaches that I meet with once a week. I have women in ministry that I'm, in an ongoing constant Marco Polo with them where we're always talking. So I have an incredible support system.
Beth Jones, can you talk a little bit about this too? Again, I know in your experiences in the academy, I know women go through all kinds of stuff. I did a study of this for a book that I did, and just the stories I've heard about tokenism, getting a female on the committee, getting a female on the panel, all of that. How do you navigate that? How do you navigate knowing that you're being used sometimes? I experience this sometimes as a person of color. I have a friend who's an Asian immigrant. Sometimes we'll do the work and then we'll bump fists and say immigrants would get the job done, which is from Hamilton. I'm not an immigrant, but son of an immigrant, so it almost counts. But I know you experienced this too. How do you navigate that? Because there's an extreme of probably gullibility where you just don't know you're being used, and there's another extreme of constant resentment and hatred for the people around you. I know that because I've experienced some of that, not because I'm putting that on you, but how do you navigate that, not falling into the ditch of suspicion and hatred of people around you because you're being used sometimes? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, it is nonstop discernment. And I think to some extent we can articulate principles for discernment, but it's a lot fuzzier than that often. And sometimes you can't articulate the principles. It's felt in the body, right? And in the space and in the relationships. I bite my tongue a lot less now that I'm older than I did when I was younger. I partly see that now as a survival skill for evangelical spaces. It's also the case that women are generally considered either nice or competent. And holding on to the nice part of it has too often been necessary, right, in order to be allowed to use one's competences. I do think there's been some shifts in kind of the public conversation, which makes some things easier to say than they once were. And I'm also intrigued here by kind of generational dynamics. I'm thinking here of a question like maternity leave, right? I worked at an institution which didn't have maternity leave until quite recently. And I found that some women who were a generation above me in some ways resented the idea that younger women might have a better package, right? And I found that through the power of the Spirit and some self-awareness, those women were able to move beyond that and really try to support the younger women. But that doesn't always happen, right? We can sometimes hold on to our older resentments and not want to lift each other up. The other thing I think it's important to say here is that a misogynistic world, a patriarchal world wounds all of us.
Yeah.
And sometimes that gives me empathy for people who are themselves wounders. Not always, but sometimes. It's not only women, right, who are groaning under these conditions. It's not only those who are most obviously sinned against. Sometimes it's also the ones with power. And there are times when I can feel some empathy there because of that. Yeah.
I want to, we have about 15, 20 minutes left. A couple questions that I want to make sure we talk about. One is the role and place of men in supporting women. What we don't want is, that person to say, I'm not racist. Look, I have this one black friend. So, the same way with women, hey, I support women. I give them jobs. What we don't want, sometimes men don't know how to be the best allies and supporters of women. That could lead to perhaps shyness, like I won't even get involved, or it could lead to overcompensation, like I'm going to hire a bunch of women. What are the, I just want to hear from both of you. What are the best ways that men can support women? I get this a lot from men who've read Tell Her Story, or have read Tara Beth's work, or have read Beth Allison Barr's work, and they want to know how can I support women without taking up the space that they should occupy? Any advice or counsel on that?
Yes. So this is such an important conversation. And the first thing I want to say is I want to encourage my brothers to not be afraid. It is so immediately clear the moment that I am talking with a man, or spend any significant time, when he is afraid, because he's afraid that he'll say it wrong or do it wrong, or and even sometimes just afraid of being in close proximity with a woman in ministry. It's wild, and it's something that we sense right away. And I want to say, just making the decision to make space is the best place to start. And here's some real practical things that men can do. Number one, it's coming alongside of women and creating space and opportunities for them. So I think back to here where I am right now, Good Shepherd Church. I would not be in this role had 3 male pastors not come alongside of me and said, "We see something in you. And we want to mentor you. We want to coach you. We want to develop you as a pastor. And we want to open up the pulpit and open up the decision-making table for you." They were incredibly intentional. Oftentimes, the temptation for men in ministry is to seek out someone to mentor that reminds them of themselves. A man. And I get it. Like, whenever I see a young woman in ministry, my heart leaps and I want to come alongside of her and I want to mentor her. So let me just say that's not a bad thing. We also have to be having a good eye for women that are gifted. I often say, how many congregations are full of women that could be pastors and incredible preachers and incredible theologians, but no one's told them that they see that in them, because their pastors are going to all the young men in the congregation and developing them and mentoring them. The second thing I want to say is, I need my brothers to preach every year or more, and teach every year or more within your congregation a biblical framework. Because people in our congregations, if they're not hearing it from their pastors, they're getting it from John Piper, they're getting it from Matt Chandler, and they're getting it from Mark Driscoll, and they're getting it from all sorts of other places. And they believe it. They just want to follow the Bible. Our people, they just genuinely want to follow the Bible, and they want to get it right. They want to obey God. And so if we're not giving them the tools to think through this, the theological tools to think through this, then our people are going to be pastored by people who believe differently than us. And that I believe that's what happened to me when I got to Pasadena, is the people just weren't equipped for it. They didn't have a theological framework, because I don't want to be the one doing that. I mean, I'm happy, I do, but for me as a pastor, I just want to get on with it and pastor. Like, I just want to shepherd people. I want to do the work of visiting the sick. I want to do the work of preaching. I want to do the work of casting vision and leading. And I don't want to be wasting my time. And not that it's a waste of, but you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't go into ministry to talk about women in ministry. I went into ministry because I wanted to preach about Jesus. I wanted to shepherd a flock. And so we need our brothers to give and teach and talk about women in your sermon illustrations. Use them. Talk about, like, because that's
Yes.
going to shape the imagination. And so I could list 8 more things, but I don't want to take up all the space here. So Beth, I would love to hear, like, what do you think? What would you add?
Thanks for that, Tara Beth. Such important stuff. I'll just say this. In my experience, there are 2 kinds of men who consider themselves allies of women. The first kind are very happy to be allies of women as long as they're doing it in a paternalistic role, with probably some condescendingness that they're not aware of, and like to perform how great and enlightened they are in being allies of women. The worst of those men use their allyship for women as an opportunity also to prey on women, and I've seen that a number of times. The other kind of man knows how to see women as fellow humans, and treats them like people, and that's very hard to do, right, in a misogynist world. We've learned to see something about implicit bias in terms of racism. I think we need to learn it more in terms of gender, right? The things we may assume without meaning to. Women too have implicit bias against women, and so that has to be fought to see women as humans, right? With whom one can do a project or have a meal, who one should build up if one sees gifts there. And who don't have to be always treated as women, but as fellow humans. You have to be able to see yourself to begin to be in that second space. And seeing ourselves well is really hard, of course, because we're broken sinners.
Thanks for that. Both of you are giving some really helpful advice for men who, I know many that want to do the right thing, but as Tara Beth said, there's sometimes intimidation. I don't want to say the wrong thing. So yeah, doing nothing does nothing. So definitely do something, but there are right ways and wrong ways to do that. I want to plug for those viewing our Seminary Now courses on women in ministry. Tara Beth has taught one, and Beth Jones has taught on theology of sex, if I recall. Is that right? Was that one of yours? Yeah. So there's lots of great courses. Lynn Kohick has one as well that should definitely be checked out. I also want to add to the conversation from my own experience, men talking to men here, sharing power, not just giving a woman a microphone. Microphones are helpful, but really, going the distance of actually sharing power. Does a lot and really put your money where your mouth is. And I've seen institutions really reshaped and changed when power is shared rather than just a microphone is handed to somebody. I remember having a conversation on a podcast where someone asked me as a person of color, how can I make sure that I'm not just using the person, as a diversity element or whatever? And I said, people will be more likely to say yes to you if you have a real relationship with them versus just kind of an email. Hey, would you do this?
That's what I mean by treating women as actual humans, right? A
Exactly.
relationship,
A
a
real
personal.
relationship, a friendship where you're sitting across the table, having a meal together and you're learning from each other. And I was a part of the John Perkins Center for Reconciliation at Seattle Pacific University when I taught there. And we used to have a representative from the Perkins Center speak to my freshman students on creating a more equitable and just society. And I'd always ask him, Tally Hairston, I'd always ask him, what's one thing that you can do to change the world? And he'd say the same thing every time. Make friendships, real friendships with people that are different than you. And so I feel like making real friendships with men and women together can be transformative, and that requires time and trust, vulnerability, and all of that. we're winding down on time. I have two more things I want to do before we finish. One is give a word of encouragement to the woman who I can't tell you, I can't tell the viewers, you guys know, but I can't tell you how many women I have interacted with just in the last couple months who have been scared off of going to seminary because they see it as a man's world, and people have even told them they don't belong. Can you just give it a word of encouragement on taking that step towards seminary?
Yeah, I want to say, first of all, you do not need to be sorry, and you do not need to apologize for your presence in spaces, for the space that you take up at a table, for the feelings that you feel when you come across pushback or misogyny or toxic patriarchy. You don't need to apologize, and you don't need to be sorry. You don't need to be sorry for your body, for the sound of your voice, for the way that you wear your hair, for this burning that you feel inside of you to preach and to teach. Not only do you need to not be sorry for that voice that God has given you and anointed you with, but be free to go and pursue that and steward that. It is not aggressive. It is not aggressive to steward and to pursue the gifts and the calling that God has for us. It's faithful. And so one of the things that I often say to women who feel these burning passions, maybe, they have those moments where they imagine teaching scriptures or leading in a Christian setting or preaching, is this: take the next faithful step, just one faithful step.
I like that.
And that next faithful step might just be going to northernseminary.edu. .edu. Northern, just go Google
it.
Northern. Just
It's
Google
actually
it.
seminary.edu.
Seminary.edu. I should remember that. Go to seminary.edu and just click on, just do it. Just click on apply, because that's what happened to me. I was a mom. I had a 10-month-old, and little did I know that I would be pregnant in 5 months after that. And I remember I was sitting there thinking, how am I going to do seminary how am I going to do this? And I was like, I'm just going to apply. I'm just going to do the hard thing, and I'm just going to apply. And that's what I did. I got on there and I applied. And after that I said, okay, what's the next faithful step? And I just kept going and just do one thing.
I love that. Beth Jones.
The ultimate encouragement is in God, who loves you, who made you, who is with you and for you, and wants good things for you, and will be with you every step of the way. A way less ultimate thing I will say is, check out joining us at Northern. There's something extraordinary going on in our classrooms in terms of relationships between men and women, the students. It's so kind and so uplifting and so holy. I can only explain it as a work of the Spirit amongst us. And I have been in a lot of classrooms where I have not seen that. But not only is Northern egalitarian in our paperwork, but I'm seeing the students build each other up, and it's really beautiful to see. So.
Yes. I love Northern too. We're all Northern people here. I do want to mention seminary now has a lot of other great seminary partners, especially regionally. If you live in Canada or if you live in other parts of the U.S., look at our seminary partners. We choose our partners. Seminary now chooses partners carefully who are all of one mind about a great seminary experience that welcomes both men and women. Last few minutes here. I'm a book guy, and I know that people love book recommendations. In fact, people either love me or loathe me for all my book recommendations because I make them buy books. But what's a book that you have read? It could be a legacy book that you read back in the day. It could be something more recently on women or women in theology or women in ministry that it's kind of one of those books that you love to recommend to people. Just throw one out there that you say, hey, go out and get this book.
So I always go, you go first, Beth.
I recommend this one all the time. Soskis's The Kindness of God, which is a series of theological essays on a number of topics about gender and theology. Earlier, Tara Beth, when you were talking about mothering, I was 40 years old and a mother of 4 reading Soskis, The Kindness of God, when I realized that be born again is a mother metaphor. It had never occurred to me. But it is. It's a mother metaphor. Lots of interesting things to think about in that book.
Love that. Love that. Yeah. So for me as a pastor, I always want to help people have a biblical framework. And like I said, I think that for me, this all boils down to hermeneutics. And there's a lot of confusion behind that. And so the books that I'm always recommending to people, first, Blue Parakeet, if you want an accessible read. Blue Parakeet, yes, there you go. Blue Parakeet is very accessible for kind of a first, step towards wanting to understand hermeneutics. Part 1 and then
the last chapter really on the women.
Yes, yeah. Part 2, he uses women in ministry as an example for understanding how to read the Bible. So number 1. Now, if you want something a little bit more heady than that, then I recommend Slaves, Women, and Homosexuals by
William Webb.
Yes, William Webb. Kind of similar approach between the two, but goes deeper but less accessible.
Yeah. Deeper. Yeah. I want to recommend a newer book, but I loved it. Amy Peeler's Women and the Gender of God. The reason I love this book is because a lot of our conversation, I think, has been about the nature of God. And this book, pretty, I think, open and shut case, says that God is not a man and there's no male preference in the nature of God. I can't believe we have to say that. I told that to Amy. I can't believe we have to say that. But this is a book that really helps men and women to understand that that there's no male preference in God. There's no male preference in the church. And that goes back to what Beth was saying about being powered by the presence and love of God. I'll say one more thing and then we'll wrap up. I went a few years ago, I went through a very difficult time of experiencing negativity on social media. And I had to kind of go through a dark night of the soul where I'm an Enneagram 3, which means I care a lot about my reputation. I care a lot about what other people think about me, probably more than most people. And I, for the first time, experienced widespread public, animosity. And I had to go through a realization that I couldn't put my heart in the hands of the public. Because they will crush it. Sometimes they fuel it, but sometimes they crush it. And so I ended up writing a Christian Today article called How to Lead When You're Hated. They changed the title to Who Canceled the Apostle Paul, so you can look it up that way. But I just want to encourage men and women who are experiencing obstacles in ministry that you do have to come to a place, and I'm sure that both Beth and Tara Beth have experienced this, where your calling can't be tethered to the popularity of the masses because the crowds are fickle. We learned that from the Gospels. So I just want to encourage anyone listening who's interested in ministry. Just as Paul said in Galatians chapter 1, verse 1, I'm called by Jesus Christ and not by mere mortals. And at the end of the day, that's what gets me through those hard times. I'm going to do last word, and you don't have to have one, but if you do, last word from Tara Beth to people listening on why women matter.
Women matter because it's half the church. Women matter because God has an incredible mission. God is at work in this world. And as why am I blinking? Then I'm the right of the Christopher Wright, as Christopher J.H. Wright says, he says, the wonder is that God invites us to join in this mission. And that's not exclusive to just one gender. And as Carolyn Custis James often says, she says the church will limp along if women and men aren't partnering together. We have a mission before us, my friends, as sent ones. And this mission is for women and men together. So women matter.
Great. Beth, last word.
Oh, I'll go back to God made women, loves women, has good plans for us, and is with us along the way.
I love it. I encourage you, anyone listening, if you're in an environment where you're being put down and being treated as lesser than, you don't have to be there. Hopefully you can be around people that can affirm and encourage you. Reach out, I'd say, to any of us, and we would be happy to encourage you and to cheer you on. Selfish plug here, pick up Tell Her Story and read about the stories of the great women heroes of the Bible that are encouragement to me and to many. We are at the end of our time. I want to thank our special guests here, Pastor Tara Beth Leach and Dr. Beth Felker Jones, for their time, for their wisdom. Read their books, watch their Seminary Now courses, check out seminarynow.com. And I'm Nijay Gupta. Thank you for being here. Signing off.